Hey everybody, how's it going? Thanks for joining us today. My name is Jeremy. I'm one of the guys here at Flyin Miata, and welcome to our Facebook Live event for this week. And today we are going to talk about clutches. Clutches are an integral part of the car, something that you interface with every time you get in your car, assuming it's manual transmission. And we have a really great clutch that's been a kind of a staple of our catalog for over a decade. So let's talk about it a little bit. So let's kind of start off with just a real brief, basic, high-level overview of what a clutch does. I have a level 2 clutch, actually a Happy Meal kit here laid out, and I'll kind of use that to show some things. You know, it's kind of hard to get too hands-on with the cars because, you know, you have to pull the transmission and all that. Basically, at the back of your engine, at the back of your engine where the crankshaft lives, there is a bolt pattern, and your flywheel bolts to that bolt pattern. And so your flywheel is physically attached to the engine. And then you have a pressure plate that physically bolts to the top of the flywheel. And in between the two, and you'll forgive me, I'm not actually going to touch that. This still has the machining oil on it so that it stores and ships and everything, and I don't want to contaminate the disc. So I'll just kind of pretend here. The clutch disc goes in between the two. And the clutch disc is splined and it is attached to the nose of the input shaft of your transmission. So your pressure plate and flywheel are attached to the engine, your disc is attached to the transmission. So when you're in neutral, this thing is just, well, more technically, these guys are spinning in circles when your engine is spinning, and this being attached to the transmission is sitting still. So when your clutch is disengage, when you're neutral, it's in the box. But then once you engage everything and then clamp this down, then it's basically the mechanism, it's super high level, mechanism by which to deliver the energy from the flywheel to the transmission, and then you can select your gears and stuff and lash all that up in the transmission, and it gets your rear wheels and the car goes zoom. So I know, really basic, and most of you probably already know that, but just in case there's some people here that are looking for a real high level setup. So you might ask yourself, why would I need a new clutch? You know, when do I need a new clutch? Well, a clutch is a wear item. Most of the time, your disc here is going to be made out of some sort of an organic material that's going to wear down over time. And then also, you know, even these steel surfaces over time, they're going to wear down as well. And how this works is basically there's springs here that apply a clamping force to the disc. And as these things wear and get thinner, it can no longer apply as much clamping force. And towards the end, I can get a little bit more technical about that. So as it wears out, you'll eventually get to a place, even with stock horsepower, if you've got a ton of miles, or if you upgrade to a turbo or a supercharger, where you're simply putting more torque through the driveline, where the clamping force is no longer sufficient to keep this stuff all locked together when you're asking for it. And then what'll happen is that they'll start to spin against each other, and then all of a sudden your RPMs are going to shoot way up, but your wheels don't go anywhere, and that's because, you know, you're slipping, you're spinning your clutch because it can no longer provide the clamping force to deliver that energy to the rear wheels. So that's the primary way when you're like, yep, I need a new clutch, is because it's just not delivering the clamping force anymore because things have gotten too thin because it's just worn out. So we offer a couple different clutch kits here. We have a level 1 kit and a level 2 kit. And I'll explain, you know, what might make the most sense for you. A stock clutch, just for example, they can hold, well, you know, don't worry about mileage, because with a clutch and mileage, really how you drive the car, and a lot of people are very kind to their clutches, a lot of people are very abusive to their clutches. So, you know, within the performance community, it's hard to kind of put a mileage on it. So think about it more as in terms of power. If you've got stock horsepower, you're going to get a ton of miles out of your clutch, or if you're really kind to it. But even if you're really nice to it, around 150 horsepower or so on NAs and NBs, your clutch is going to start to slip. And if you add one of our turbo kits, or you know, some of the older supercharger kits that are on the market, even the minimum base level kits are usually 160, 170 horse. And so no matter what, if you put a forced induction kit on your car, with very, very few exceptions, like the old Jackson Racing kit running at 6 PSI that only made about 140 horse, you could maybe milk your clutch for a while there. But for pretty much anything else on the market, you're gonna slip your clutch, and you're gonna want to do an upgraded clutch along with it. And there's a lot of them on the market. We've developed this one to be really friendly, and that's a kind of a key thing. So we have two levels. We have a level 1 and a level 2. From the perspective, how does it feel to drive? Now, all of our clutches utilize a sprung organic disc. So that's going to have a nice smooth engagement, just like the stock disc, which is sprung and organic. And note, we use the same disc for the level 1 and the level 2. Same flywheel for the level 1 and the level 2. So the only difference between the level 1 and the level 2 is in the pressure plate, which we'll talk about in a second. There are some clutches on the market which would be unsprung, and those are going to give you a much more harsh engagement feel. There's some that are even like race clutches that are actually called puck clutches, and instead of having a nice round surface, they've just got little, 4 or 5 or 6 individual pucks coming out. Those are also much harder to drive and much less streetable. So for a good streetable experience, if this is anything less than a pure race car, the vast majority of people are going to want this sprung organic disc. Now, so how about pedal effort? Some people think, oh, in order to get a really strong clutch, I'm going to have this really crazy pedal that's really hard to push. Not necessarily. When we design these, we put a lot of energy into kind of redesigning the fulcrum of the springs so that we could still get an improved and increased clamping force. It's going to increase the pedal effort, but without a crazy, super high increase to the pedal effort. So for example, this is some testing that we did probably, 12 or 15 years ago, so it's kind of off the top of my head, but a stock clutch was about 9 pounds of pedal effort. So if you put a scale on your pedal, how many pounds of force does it take to push the pedal to the floor? It was about 9 pounds. Our level 1 clutch was, off the top of my head, I think it was about 12 pounds. So it's a little bit more, but really still, it's not that much. And then the level 2 was about 24 pounds. So the level 2 clutch was considerably more force, and it's also got considerably more clamping force. So, for most people in most situations, say you've got a stock clutch, when it wears out, should you get another stock clutch? Well, we would still recommend just getting one of our level 1 clutches because the pedal effort isn't significantly more than stock. It has much greater clamping force, so you can do a turbo kit and be good to go, or even with a stock car, it probably could last longer because it's got more clamping force, so there's more room for it to wear. And then save the level 2 clutches for people that are doing the built internal engines on the NAs and NBs, or doing the larger, with the bigger turbo kits and making extra horsepower. So generally speaking, from a power perspective, anyone who has an engine with stock internals on NAs and NBs, whatever you can do to that engine with stock internals, you're going to be fine with a level 1 clutch. And the level 2 clutch we generally recommend to people that have a forged internal engine who are kind of going in that 300 horsepower plus range, where, you get up over that 300 horsepower at the wheels range, you're going to need the level 2 clutch to take it on up from there. Technically, the level 1 clutch is rated for about 318 foot-pounds, which is more than you're going to do on a stock engine. So, that's why we say it can handle pretty much anything you can do on a stock engine. That's just an easy barometer to remember is, are my internals stock? Do I have a big turbo making over 300 horse or not? The level 2 clutch is rated for 353. We can tell you from experience that we believe that's conservative. We have built a number of big horsepower turbo cars here, including that one, which we've run on the dyno up to 425 wheel and blown transmissions up and never hurt the clutch. We've built a number of big horsepower 3071 stroker cars for customers over the years that were close to or exceeding 400 wheel and up in the high 300s, even close to 400 foot-pounds of torque with our level 2. One that I can think of that's been on the road for 8-10 years now, and I mean, to my knowledge, it's a weekend car, but still, to my knowledge, is still running the original clutch. So it's a fairly conservative rating, and I'd have no problem with recommending our level 2 clutch, up into the low 400 range to be really reliable, even though that's a little bit more than the rating. If you start to get up in the 500 and 600 horsepower range, you're going to want to do something different. But to be honest, there are so few people up there, you're looking at some sort of a custom specialized setup. So we sell the level 1 and the level 2. If you buy a car and it has one on it and you want to tell the difference, there's one way to tell. On the pressure plate, there's a number of springs right here. The level 1 has 3 springs, the level 2 has 4 springs. And so if you get a second-hand one and you want to know if it's a level 1 or a level 2, that's how you can tell, is by counting these springs. Because like I said, the disc and the flywheel are the same. Also, by looking at it visually, with our level 1 pressure plate, we're using basically an OE style stock throwout bearing, release bearing, whereas on our level 2, this is actually a custom bearing that we had made for the level 2. That it's actually based off of a Nissan pickup truck, as I recall, but it's just much beefier and much heavier duty, and it's all steel, whereas the OE level 1 style, factory style throwout bearings have a little bit of plastic on them. So, those are the two visual ways that you'll be able to tell a level 1 setup from a level 2 setup if you see one in the wild. So the engagement with either one of these is really fairly smooth. You're not going to have any issues with that thanks to the organic sprung setup. So let's see. Sorry, I have some notes here for things to talk about today. And also keep in mind, we will put product links in the video description, and as with all of our products in the web store, if you click on the More Information tab, you can find our instructions. So I'm not going to talk about how to install a clutch today. You can go and download the instructions and you can see all that information. And also, most of this information is going to be related to the NA and the NB. The NC is basically the same thing, just with a slightly different footprint. The ND is different because the ND is something that we haven't brought to market quite yet, although we've done some testing. But the ND does have a different setup in that there is no external adjustment available for the pedal, whereas the NAs, NBs, and NCs have an external adjustment available, which we talk about how to do that in the instructions. So we also have lightweight flywheels. Over the years, we've sold 10-pounders, 13-pounders. Stock is about 19 or 20 pounds off the top of my head, as I recall. And these days, we're just selling the 10-pounder because it's kind of in the sweet spot. And these are all chromoly. 12, 15 years ago, we were selling an aluminum flywheel that just had a shrunk-on steel ring gear that it was private labeled for us by Fidanza. And that was about 9 pounds as well. Even though they're both 9 pounds, this one is quieter and it's nicer. We like this one better. What does a lightweight flywheel do for you? There's a number of things that a lightweight flywheel does, and for most people, especially people driving Miatas, it's going to be a benefit. And so, generally speaking, we would recommend getting all these things as a package deal. The main thing that you notice is just in the revability of the engine. When you have a lightweight flywheel, it's, you've got this moment of inertia of this thing spinning and, the weight and the distance from center line. With the heavier it is, it's more work for the engine to spin the thing up faster. So when you blip the throttle, with a stock flywheel, it kind of revs up slower. With a light flywheel, it's going to rev up faster. So that allows you to do certain things. Like, for example, if you're trying to downshift and rev match, you can rev match easier because you can get it to where it needs to go quicker. It's just more free spinning. It does provide a little bit quicker acceleration in first and maybe second gears, but by third gear, you're probably not going to notice. As a side note, if any of you guys are RX-7 guys, a lightweight flywheel on an RX-7 makes an order of magnitude difference, whereas on a piston engine, it's not quite as much, just because of the way the beer keg works versus the Boinger. So that's kind of an interesting thing. One of my absolute favorite things about a lightweight flywheel that doesn't get a whole lot of attention actually is in what's called throttle steer. So with that moment of inertia, the car, when you have a heavy flywheel, it also doesn't spin down as fast. And when it doesn't spin down as fast, the car doesn't slow down as fast. Say you're lifting, and so the balance of the car doesn't move as much. When you have a lightweight flywheel, when you lift, it's going to spin down faster, which is going to do more weight transfer. So one thing that I really always enjoyed on track is putting effort into trying to develop my steering angle in compensation with the throttle steer by being able to, accelerate and transfer weight onto the back wheels, which is going to lighten up the front and cause you to push a little bit, or by decelerating and putting a little bit more weight forward, which is going to put more weight on the front wheels, which is going to increase your turn in a little bit. So you can find that you can actually steer with your right foot to an extent while keeping your wheel at a steady state. And so throttle steer is a really fun thing that having a lightweight flywheel just helps to exaggerate. you know, it's going to be a much more pronounced phenomenon than you're going to see with the heavy flywheel. I'm sure there's more things that we can talk about with light flywheels, but we can kind of move on from there. Let's see. Installation time. On all 4 generations, the installation time is really about the same. You know, the book time is in the neighborhood of 3 3/4 hours for, you know, if you're to be a shop and to look up book rate on what it takes to do these. So, you know, for a guy home in his garage, you should be able to do a clutch in a day. It's a big job, but not a huge job. You know, it's really more about kind of muscling the weight around, getting the transmission out of the way, and then, you know, how many cuss words can you say while you're trying to re-stab the thing back together before you actually get it. So when you're installing a clutch, once again, I'm not going to get too into detail because we have that stuff in the instructions, and if you have more detailed instruction questions, feel free to reach out to support@flyinmiata.com, and our wonderful CSRs can help you guys out. But our kits do come with a clutch alignment tool, and what this guy does is this replicates the input shaft of your transmission, so that when you install all these things, you can get everything lined up exactly right. Yeah, it's on the wrong side, but once again, I don't want to get this all oily because it's got the oil on here, which will contaminate this guy. But you put all that together, you install it, and then you shove this guy through the middle, which keys into the splines here, and then here is your pilot bearing, and your pilot bearing is pressed into your flywheel in this hole here, and then this nose is in here like this. So what this tool does is it squares up the whole assembly so that when you go to bolt everything down, it's perfectly square, so that when you actually go to install it on the engine, and this is your actual input shaft, that it's going to slide right in because everything's square because of this tool. So it would be not impossible, but extremely difficult, if not close to impossible, to install these correctly without this simple little plastic tool, because everything's bolted down, and once it's bolted down, it's not going anywhere. What else does our kit come with? One other really nice thing that we have is this little guy, this clip. So on the clutch pedal on NAs and NBs, there are 2 switches, and that's important to remember. One of the switches is a neutral switch, which works in series. I think it's in series with the one on the transmission, and that tells your computer, one of the ways that it helps to tell your computer when it's in neutral. And that one is kind of above your toes and has fat wires. Yeah, I got that right. And then there's also a starter inner, wait, toes and skinny wire? Anyway, it's above your toes. The one above your shoelaces, right? Those are shoelaces?
One at the top of the pedal is for the ECU, the one at the bottom of the pedal is for the starter.
I think the one above your shoelaces is where this thing goes.
It's on the firewall.
Oh, it's backwards? Okay, I got that backwards. So the one above your shoelaces is the neutral switch. That's right, because that one's got the skinny wires because it's only passing a signal to the ECU. Okay, got that backwards. Time to fix. The one above your toes has the thicker wires, and that is the starter interlock. And that's the one that basically you can't turn over the starter until you push the clutch to the floor to close that switch. And yeah, that's where the thick wires are. And so what this does is basically there's a plunger on it, and you slide this over that, and it just basically holds the plunger down forever. And why that's important is, in keeping in mind, that means that now you're not required to depress the clutch pedal to start the engine. So you have to be very careful and relearn how you do this so that you're not leaving the thing in gear and then just hopping in and turning it over, and then you're trying to start the car while it's in gear. I think someone in the crowd has done that. So the reason you want to do that is because inside the engine on the crankshaft, you've got a series of bearings. You know, you've got your crank bearings, your rod bearings, and also the brain fart, the thrust bearing. And when you depress the clutch, you're putting a lot of pressure right here, and all that pressure is transferring through here, through the crankshaft, and up against the thrust bearing, which has a coating of oil on it. When you get into the heavier clutches, it's just nice to not be squeezing that every time you start the car. You know, cars maintain a warranty with this. There are factory cars that have really heavy clutches, you know, some of the high performance American cars, for example, and they maintain a warranty with it. We just figure, why wear it out faster if you don't have to? Especially since considering things like the 99 and early 2000 cars, you know, a lot of those lost engines early on because they had misspec thrust bearings that kind of chewed themselves up, and then you dropped oil pressure. So in the nature of just why wear it out faster if you don't have to, we have this little switch so that you can just get used to starting the car without pressing in the clutch and make everything live a little bit longer. And that's just part of all of our clutch kits. So one thing I just thought of about the flywheel also affects your idle quality because of that moment of inertia. You will have a better idle quality with a stock flywheel because it's heavy and it spins itself from that weight. With a lighter flywheel, the idle quality isn't going to be quite as good. With a stock ECU, you're probably never going to notice. With a standalone ECU, it's going to make your idle adjustments a little bit more of a challenge. It's not that big of a deal, but just to be aware. Also, with a light flywheel, something you're going to learn in the first hour of driving your new setup is that it does take a little bit more milking to get the car started from a stop when you're accelerating in first gear, because once again, there's not as much inertia to carry things through as you're trying to engage the clutch. So generally speaking, to make it smooth, you know, you're going to slip it a little bit more, and it might be awkward the very first few times you drive it, but within a day or so, you know, you're going to get used to it, and it's really going to be no issue. But, you know, just something to be aware of. Okay, so what if I have a 1.6 or a 1.8? So the setups are slightly different. All of the clutch kits that we sell are 1.8 clutches. So if you have a 1.8 engine in the car and you want to keep a stock flywheel, this will bolt right up. If you want this, that'll bolt right up too. Now, if you have a 1.6 engine, the clutch and the flywheel setup is physically different in a 1.6 engine. So if you want to put the performance clutch in your 1.6 engine, you have to get the whole thing. And this as a package will bolt right up to your flywheel. But these parts are not going to interchange with your 1.6 parts. So hopefully that makes sense. And we do kind of have that, you know, described in the web store. So when you're picking stuff out, you should have that verbiage there as well. As far as abuse in racing, you know, someone asked, what about, you know, what clutch should I choose if I'm autocrossing? As described with the power levels, you know, that's a totally appropriate thing. You know, over the years, there have been a few situations where a guy said, you know, I'm really abusive on my clutches. Or, you know, for example, in road racing, you're generally pretty smooth. In autocross, there can be a lot of shifting depending on how you drive. Moral of the story is don't worry about what type of driving you're doing. You know, drag racing, obviously, you're going to, well, generally people are going to be a little harder on their clutches when they're drag racing. If you know that you're abusive on your clutches and you don't mind having a heavier pedal, you may want to overclutch. You know, at 200 horse, you may want to go with a level 2 if you know that you really just like to, you know, ham fist the clutch pedal. That's okay. As long as you're okay with having that higher pedal effort, go for it. You know, because at the end of the day, it's more important to be reliable, right? So it's kind of a personal decision. You know, you want to have that information so that you can make the best decision for your specific needs. Long-term health effects of aftermarket clutches and engine health. The only possible thing would be what we talked about with the bearing and putting this little doohickey on there so that you can not have to worry about that. Let's see. As far as adjustments, we had some questions about adjustments. I'm going to defer to the instructions on the adjustments because that goes into it in detail. But the one thing that I will mention is that the Miata NA and NB clutch has 2 adjustments on it. And if you're doing this job or if you're dropping this off at a shop and having them do the job, read the instructions. Because a lot of guys are like, oh, I've done a clutch before. I'm going to throw this in. They do the one adjustment, and then we're guaranteed to get a call. Because there's 2 adjustments. There's the stop has an adjustment and the rod length has an adjustment. And because we've changed the fulcrum on here, you have to maximize that length without going too far, because if you go too far, you cover up the bleed hole and you have a whole different set of problems. So read the instructions. And I will add, we like to recommend adjusting your clutch once when you install it, And then after 1,000 or so miles of break-in, go back and do it again, because things change a little bit, which I'll touch on in a little technical section here in a little bit. So if you redo it after that break-in period, after that, you should be good to go for the life of the setup. Let's see. Well, let's just go ahead and talk about that. Word of the day, Marcel. Do you know what a Marcel is? The Marcel is the metal part in between the two organic halves of the clutch, and it compresses a little bit. Bet you didn't know that. So when these are built, they're built a little on the thick side. Now keep in mind the geometry of where the pressure plate relating to the thickness of the disc, relating to the surface of the flywheel, has the maximum clamping force is not when it's brand new. When it's brand new, it's a little thicker, because we know that in the first, during the break-in period, let's call it, about 10 to 20% of the thickness is going to go away. And we know that that's going to happen, so when we build it new, we build them a little bit thicker, so that once that break-in occurs and it kind of comes to that point where it should be stable then after that initial break-in, that geometry is where the maximum clamping force is. And also because that little bit of wear happens, that's also why we recommend readjusting your pedal after the break-in period. So just a little bit of tech information. The discs start off at 308 thousandths. 308 is a great number, by the way. So the theoretical minimum thickness is 250 thousandths, plus or minus, for a minimum. So also when this wears a long time, that's once we talked about in the very beginning, when this gets too thin, it's not going to clamp as well anymore. But that's going to live a lot longer on a 120 horse car than it is on a 250 horse car, as far as having that slip from it being too thin. So it's kind of just situation specific. Yeah, that kind of really covers that concept. Just the main thing being that the Marcel is compressible, so you actually have to compress this with a clamp if you want to get an accurate reading, if you really want to know how thick it is, or just pragmatically, after the break-in is when you've got your maximum clamping force, and then it just wears out over its lifespan until it's too thin, and then you replace it. So really, that's clutches. They're pretty straightforward. They're extremely necessary, and we have one that works really well and we're very happy with. So now I'd say let's go ahead and open it up to any live questions, and we can take it from there before we call it a day. So, folks in the back with the computer, do we have any live questions?
We have one gentleman who would like to know if fried clutch tastes anything like fried chicken.
It doesn't smell anything like fried chicken. Fried alligator tastes like fried chicken, except it's a little greasier. Fried clutch is kind of greasy. At least that's how it feels. And it smells horrible. Sometimes when you're taking off these materials, you'll see on the metal surfaces, these things will develop hot spots. And the hot spots are very, very hard. So, sometimes people will take off their flywheel and have it machined. Just remember, if you have it machined, the bosses have to be machined the same amount that the surface is machined, because the relationship between the bosses and the surface is an important part of the geometry. If you have a bunch of hot spots on here, it may not machine well, because the bits are going to skip over the hot spots because the material is so hard. Realistically, these are not that expensive. And if you've got a good amount of use out of the thing and you take it apart, just replace it. Time is money, and taking a transmission out of a car isn't something you want to be doing any more often than you have to. So really, it's better to just replace. These are a wear item. So, no? Nothing else from you guys?
You got a question?
Oh, question. The commentator over here is digesting the question before he regurgitates it.
And this, well, I'll let you answer it. It's not, Okay, what is the highest reasonable RPM to slip the clutch when you have the trifecta of a Happy Meal, AC on, and timing retarded for the FM turbo kit? I would say
So the question was a whole host of things trying to get way more specific than you can possibly give an answer to. But as far as how high of an RPM can you slip the clutch, I would suggest the answer is, how often do you want to replace your clutch? Serious. Okay, for example, on the Hydra ECUs we used to sell, the Hydra ECUs had a launch control function where we could manipulate the fueling and the timing in order to hold the RPM at a certain point so that you could basically mash the throttle and control your launch purely with your left foot, with the clutch pedal. It was great. It actually worked really well. And it smoked clutches. So anytime somebody wanted to use it, I'd say, yeah, it's a really great feature, and we sell clutches. And if you want to use it, just you're going to buy more clutches, and that's fine. You just have to decide, is the return on the experience worth what you're going to have to put into it to continue having those experiences? For example, the rally teams that would do anti-lag, how long do you think their turbos lasted, right? If you can afford to replace, because the Hydras also did anti-lag, if you could afford to replace turbos on a regular basis, anti-lag is fantastic. Same thing with, really high RPM clutch slipping. You're going to create hot spots. You're going to wear stuff out faster. And it's fun. So, and as far as all the other things in there, that it's really not an issue. This is a mechanical thing. You're trying to move a vehicle that weighs a certain amount of weight, and, in trying to get that vehicle moving from a stop, all the peripheral stuff doesn't really matter. It's just, how abusive are you on the clutch? So that might not have answered your question, but it kind of answers the question, if that makes sense.
necessary to keep it from stalling.
So, any other questions pop up?
Yes, actually, we are getting more. DIY method of resurfacing or preparing the surface of a used flywheel.
So a DIY method for resurfacing a flywheel or preparing the surface. Obviously, machining is not a DIY operation. So let's just start with basic prep. When you get one of these new, it's going to be coated in oil. Oil is bad for the installation. Oil is necessary for the manufacturing and for the shipment and for the storage, so you don't get it rusty new out of the box. When you install it, it's critical that you clean all of this off with, would you guys use carb? Hey Matt, would you use carb cleaner or brake cleaner to clean one of these off?
Either one is good.
So Matt, one of our awesome mechanics, says either carb cleaner or brake cleaner to clean off the metal surfaces. And once you clean them, do not touch them with your fingers anymore. Get them clean and don't touch the surfaces when you're doing the installation. Because you don't want oil, even fingerprint oil. You'll take some of these out sometime and you'll see a nice fingerprint shaped hot spot on there or something like that. So, but the question was, when it's used, to re-prep these in the past, and Matt, our mechanic, can correct me if I'm wrong, but I've seen the guys use Scotch-Brite pads on a whiz wheel. Do you use any chemicals? No. So Matt says no chemicals, just, get a Scotch-Brite pad on an air-powered whiz wheel, and you can use that to kind of clean and prep the surface on the metal sides. And then when you're done, once again, get it real clean with the brake cleaner or the carb cleaner, and then put it together. And that's what you got. So, any other questions?
Yep. How do I know if I need to replace my clutch?
How do you know if you need to replace your clutch? Is it slipping? So clutches are very pragmatic things. Either they clamp and they deliver the energy that the engine is requesting to the rear wheels, or they slip and they don't. So if you're in a position where your RPM is going like this and your wheels are going like this, then you're probably slipping your clutch. And also you'll have some pretty bad smells, kind of sort of like fried chicken, right? No, I don't think it smells like fried chicken, but it's a very distinctive smell when you slip your clutch. It's kind of just, it's cooking of this organic material, and it just doesn't smell good at all. So the bad smells, which indicate the slipping, or the obvious slipping, are the two primary ways you're going to know you're going to need to slip your clutch. Or if you install a Flyin Miata turbo kit, you know you're going to need to replace your clutch. So you might as well just go ahead and do it. Other questions? All right. All right, well, thank you guys for joining today. You know, we really appreciate your time, and we very much appreciate your business. So from all the guys here at Flyin Miata, thank you again, and feel free to reach out to any of our CSR guys or anybody else if you have any questions. And until next time, take care.